Pauline is charged with manufacturing meth. She's on her third boyfriend in the last year. This one's exciting, and he seems to always have money available. And he was dealing pills, and he had this idea to branch out since meth was moving its way across Kentucky towards the east and get into the meth manufacturing business. So he got the ingredients, he did the research. Turns out he's not so good at recipes, but Pauline really is. So Pauline took over the recipe part of cooking the meth and getting it to happen. And she ended up being charged with manufacturing meth. Her boyfriend pled very quickly and pointed the finger at her as the mastermind and had lots of evidence against her. She got very lucky. She got Scott West as her lawyer, her public defender, who's the leading lawyer trainer on meth cases in Kentucky and around that area as well. So Scott got into the case. He started his motion practice. He started investigating and getting experts and doing everything that he does and teaches everybody else how to do, and figured out that this is not a case you want to go to trial on. And in meth, also the year before, they had an omnibus meth bill went through the legislature, where it was about making it hard to get certain drugs at pharmacies, but also manufacturing meth became a Class B felony, 10 to 20 years. And everybody, juries in particular, thought those were the real bad guys. So Scott, and I trust him because he's a great lawyer, decided the best bet was to work out a plea. And the best he could get was a plea to the minimum, which was 10 years, but keeping probation on the table. And the prosecutor wasn't going to argue no probation. In Kentucky, the judge can make a decision in nonviolent cases in certain situations where there's not priors to probate somebody, even if they're facing a Class B felony. But he looked at what he had there, and he knew this situation. He knew the political climate. He knew the judge. He knew his judge didn't care. His prosecutor didn't really care about what would happen. And he thought there's really no mitigation in this case. There's not much to go on. He didn't have a lot of time. He has a huge caseload, and he was running an office at that point in time. So why? It's pretty much a losing effort to get up and make an argument in front of the judge at sentencing to probate her. Why bother? Some people might think. But it's the job, right? That's why we're there. That's why Scott was there. And you go with what you got. So he did. He got up and made his pitch for probation. In Kentucky, unlike most states, we don't have court reporters or transcriptions. They videotape everything. So I'm going to share with you some of the videotape of what happened with Scott West and Pauline through this presentation. It's great for trainers. It's horrible for appellate lawyers. So they have to transcribe themselves, basically. But it's nice for us and what we're going to do. So let's watch Scott. He's going to give it a shot here with what he's got in this case to try to get her probation rather than being sent off to prison for 10 years. So Scott gives it a shot, right? He's got a good list. There's got the bullet list of things that may be helpful here. He leads with the law is too punitive. He reminds the judge this is her first offense. She was pretty upfront with the lawyer. She understands the magnitude. She's young. She's reformable. She's remorseful. We got some stuff in there. She's going through a rough time. He throws in the thing about what's going on with her child, what's happening there. And he has the 9 times she's gone to AA. So what happens? Well, we get the judge who immediately agrees, which you guys know is a bad sign if they start out with being on your side. But let's watch what happens. So you can see where that was going. This is one of the best lawyers in Kentucky, Scott West. He gave it his shot there, but everything was stacked up against him. The judge, agrees that it's a harsh penalty. Goes with the unduly depreciates the seriousness of the offense. And I don't think that came up when we were talking with Keith earlier about the things that happen with negotiations. For me, that seems in the same genre of if you let gay people marry, it will unduly mess up what marriage really is. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's a serious offense and one person using your discretion. But that's what happened. So he didn't probate her there. We'll come back to this, but I think what I'm asking you guys to think about, what we're going to play with over the next hour, is how do I get them to care? And I understand you have different sentencing procedures here, and I guess in misdemeanors you have an opportunity close to this to convince a judge to probate yourself, but because of sentencing guidelines, you may not have a situation exactly like this there. So I'm asking you guys to generalize. So when I'm talking about sentencing mitigation, I think it also relates back to negotiation. You're going to use these same skills. If it's whoever gets to make the choice and is that decision maker about how long the penalty is or whether someone goes to prison or not, all of the stuff I'm talking about can be used with that person. Sometimes it's a judge, sometimes it's a prosecutor, sometimes it's the police officer, like Keith was mentioning earlier. So what I'm going to talk about is how do you make them care? How do you get somebody to give for our client? My niece is in the back of the room, so I'll censor myself.
Is that a question for us?
Not yet. I'm gonna go with it, and then you ask me questions later if I don't get to where you're going. So I'm gonna go brain science first. There's been studies, and as fMRIs have come along, and the way we can look into people's brains has come along that teach us some things about how we get people to care. So let me show you another video about what some studies are saying. So all we need to do if we want to get the prosecutor or the judge to care and to take action in a way that helps that person they care about is take a giant syringe, stick it in their brain, and put in oxytocin and cortisol, right? So BJA has supplied us with syringes that we'll be handing out. No. That's a secret gift, the parting gift. I gave it away. No, but we don't need the syringe. There's this story thing that's been around for millennium that we're immersed in that we should think about as a tool to do that. And when we watched Scott earlier, he went with the list approach. He had lots of good reasons, but it was more like walking through the zoo. Here's an interesting polar bear. Let's go see the sea lion. And at the end, the judge says, yeah, that was an interesting polar bear, but no, I'm not going to do anything nice for your client. You know, it didn't make that connection. So this story arc is science, but it's also kind of magic and what can happen there. So I want to talk to you about two elements of it. One is just getting people's attention and how you do that. And then I'm going to get in some more detail. You know, I've looked at this story arc and played with it for a couple of years, and there's this other structure that works better in my mind that I'll talk to you about. So we're going to talk about how stories work in the context of sentencing mitigation. And think about whoever you're persuading, however you persuade them. So this could be a written memorandum where you're telling the story of your client, that you're doing it through that. It could be in negotiation, it could be to a judge, it could be through a sentencing video like Raj is going to talk about later. Stories are everywhere, all around us, and we're all on our own journeys in these stories. What really is mitigation? I work in a lot of capital cases and do a lot of consulting on capital cases. And it's really common that people will start out the case review with, I've got no mitigation in my case. He's got an IQ in the 80s, he didn't have a bad childhood, he has got no trauma, there's no mental illness, I'm screwed. There's no mitigation here. And that's narrowly thinking about mitigation in the weird way that we view the world. We're going, yeah, he's intellectually disabled. But it's much broader than that. So what I invite people to do in those case reviews and what I'm asking you to think about is mitigation is anything that will get their attention, that cortisol thing that they were talking about, just get the judge to wake up and makes them connect with that person. And the world is full of that. And I'm going to talk about some things to look at first and then a structure to do it. Brain Rules is the book when you go on Amazon to buy Getting to Yes. Brain Rules, I checked, if you go with the first edition, it's only 4 cents used. If you want the new edition, it's $10. So Getting to the Yes and Brain Rules. John Medina he's from here. Anyone know him? I've never talked to him. Yeah. He's a professor at Washington University, I guess, who is a brain scientist and teaches this stuff. But in Brain Rules, he writes it up in a way that my little brain can understand. So it's very readable. So what he does is he uses evolutionary theory as a way to help us understand what the studies are showing with that. My caveat is I am from Kentucky, so whenever I talk about evolutionary theory, I need to say, if you believe in that stuff. We are the home of the Creation Museum where dinosaurs and Eve were hanging out together at the same time. So you can do that, even without, if you don't buy the evolutionary nice stories that go with it, the science is still science. The evolution is just a good way to remember it. So emotions grab our attention. right? And commercials use this all the time to try to stop you from fast forwarding through it or getting up and leaving. So I'm going to show us some commercials and talk about some of the strategies they use, right? So they use the threat of violence. They get your attention with just kind of, what is this? And then shock you and grab you with the attention. It's Bonnie, right? You know, she sat straight up when that thing happened. Anyone remember this commercial? It's like 9 years ago now. So it stuck with you for whatever reason.
I knew the crash was coming when you started it.
Because you remembered it, but you probably haven't seen it for 8, 9 years since it was on, because it sticks. It makes that connection in your brain, grabs your attention, you remember it. So what Medina talks about is there are 3 sets of questions that the studies show are true and make sense if you buy that evolutionary thing. That we pay attention to these 3 things. The first one is, can I eat it or will it eat me? Makes sense, right? If you didn't pay attention to that, you would starve to death if you were a caveman, or you would be saber-toothed tiger food. So we're programmed to pay attention to that, and we still pay attention to it many, many years later. So threats of violence wake us up, like in that commercial. However, threats of violence usually don't help our cases. Self-defense cases, there's exceptions, some of them there are, but usually that's where the prosecutor is hammering away on the threats of violence. But all of these can be extended because we've evolved a bit. And we're not dealing with saber-toothed tigers every day. But we do pay attention to this food and threat in terms of food. We also pay attention to free stuff. There's free coffee out there. That wakes you up, right? We notice things that when we have this gain that we didn't expect, we pay attention to that. And with the threat, the violence and death, it's loss. If somebody's going to take something away from you, you pay attention to that. So that opportunity of gain or threat of loss. So if you watch late night television, buy now or you'll lose your chance of buying this Ginzu knife. You know, commercials use both of those all the time. You're going to get this thing free if you don't miss out on your opportunity. Whoa, we pay attention to that. And that's related back to just trying to survive saber-toothed tigers. So there's, in our client stories, in your own stories, you'd be hard-pressed to find an individual who doesn't have loss somewhere in their background, in their story. So that's an area to explore and to think about when you're creating the story arc that we'll talk about later. So that's the first one. Can I eat it? Will it eat me? The second one, can I mate with it and will it mate with me? Right? Because those genes got to get passed on somehow. So we're programmed to pay attention to that. Right? So that comes as the obvious one of sex appeal. We pay attention to that. And commercials use it in odd ways where suddenly a dish TV is something that's about a woman with a horse, but it gets people's attention, or at least Dish TV thinks it does. So we pay attention to that. But again, this is an area probably not so much for us. The sex appeal approach, not so much with most of our judges. But this also gets extended though, because it's about the idea of reproducing. So family connections, stories of family are things we pay attention to. And all of our clients got some sort of story of family going on. They got here somehow. They weren't manufactured in a lab. And for most of our clients, that also relates back to that first one, right? Because family and loss tends to be a theme that we see in our world. So that gets people to pay attention when you go those places in your storytelling. The third one's not quite as obvious as other things. We also are programmed to recognize patterns. This thing is like something else I've seen before. That we wake up for that. Medina explains it as the brain pays attention to patterns. Remembering something we've seen before, like quicksand, is a useful evolutionary trait. 2 caveman brothers are walking along that path. One brother steps in that weird-looking sand and goes down and never seen again. If the other brother's brain has developed in such a way that they have good pattern recognition, a year later, they see similar sand, whoa, and they go on and they pass that trait on, so it shows up in us. So we recognize patterns. That's why tools like looping in direct examination, stories that come back again to the beginning, we pay attention to. We're also recognizing patterns. You're doing it right now. Everything that's coming out of my brain, you're connecting up to your life experience. Do I buy that or not? So there's pattern recognition going all the time. Some of you are nodding your heads, and I'm thinking hopefully you're seeing an example, or you're just being nice to me. Others maybe not making that connection, but I have to be aware of it if I'm trying to persuade somebody else to do something. They've got their own thing going on, and I need to find ways to connect with that. So one way for us is that's about knowing the person you're persuading. What's important to this prosecutor? What's important to this judge? This prosecutor has a nephew who has a substance abuse problem, so they might be looking at those cases in a different way. You know, it's not in a manipulative way, but it's just being aware of the patterns and the recognition that they see going on in the way. So I like this Steinbeck quote, and I think Colette mentioned it yesterday. You know, if the story's not about the hearer, he will not listen. So that commercial showed only one time. When was it?
Super Bowl.
Super Bowl? It's an old enough audience that they remember. You were there around then. When I teach this to college students, they have no idea what I'm talking about. But it uses all of those, right? There's this threat of violence of the totalitarian regime there. There's the sex appeal of the woman running down the aisle in the shorts. There's also, related to that, is that Macintosh was trying to position itself as a more holistic feminine approach to this. So they were saying IBM is all these men, and this is a better approach to it, so that's a connection that's there as well. And there's the pattern recognition. It was 1984, people talking about the book. If you've seen the movie 1984, it uses very similar cinematography and lighting to what you saw there. So if you just saw that during the commercial, you might first think it's a commercial for the movie that's coming out. So we connected up on all three of those, and that went viral, right? But there wasn't even an internet back then. You know, just people talked about it, news shows repeated it. It became a thing in a way that you wouldn't think was possible back in 1984, because it uses all of these. So let's think back on what I've just shown you and talked about with Pauline, and what was going on with Scott West's client Pauline there. What, in the little bit that you know, where is there one of these things going on that might be explored? And this is where I'm throwing it out to you. Yeah. Her child, right? That was kind of a throwaway, the second to last in the list, which is usually kind of the place with primacy and recency you put the stuff that's not important. But it's there, right? And it's a combination. It's this, you know, and Dumbo's got the loss thing going on as well. You know, it's the idea of a child having surgery without his mom there, that some of you, even in that list format, probably paid attention to that. Scott, in that moment, it was just kind of buried in the bullet list approach, and it didn't work in that context.
Is there any way that she could have a...
So let me set this up. So what happened, though, is after the judge agreed with him and then stuck it to his client, he went back and talked to her some more and came back to the judge with one more request. So what ends up happening is the judge keeps putting it off and goes through the rest of his docket, and then I don't have it on video because he calls the prosecutor and Scott back into chambers and says, you know, I'm going to let her be there for the surgery. And he just delays. He said, we're going to continue the sentencing for 2 weeks till after the surgery so she can be there for him. So that made a bit of a difference there. So let's get back to talking about story and story structure some more. We've talked about the ways that you can get people to pay attention, to get that cortisol kind of release. But that's not enough, it's just waking them up. Now we need to put it into that dramatic arc and think about how that works. Let me make sure So why stories are important because they allow us, the decision maker, to transcend the case and kind of put themselves in that situation. When you hear a story, there's part of you going along on the same journey with the characters in the story. And along the way, you're either understanding and agreeing with their decisions or disagreeing with their decisions, or you're seeing what could happen in the future. Don't open that door, don't open that door. You know, there's those moments, but you're on this journey with them. And stories invite the listener to go on a journey with them. Think about stories as a timeline. In most of our cases, there's this event, this thing that happens. You know, he pointed a gun in his head, he pulled the trigger, boom, he's dead, murder, done. That's all the prosecutor needs to say, right? But for us, it's usually much more context that we're putting it into. So taking that moment in time and we're backing it up to what happened before that. Why did he pull the trigger? He was being threatened. You know, it may be a self-defense case. And we're also talking about what happened afterwards. After he pulled the trigger, he got on 911, he called the police, he sat there crying on the porch until the police got there. It's a different story then versus him running away. A lot of times the context goes back even before our client was born. Again, I'm from Kentucky, so we got the Hatfields and McCoys. The feuds are real things that go for generations, and family, that's part of their culture and their family. If you do capital cases or juvenile cases, often we're talking about things that happen in utero, things that were going on with the mother at the time. The story goes way back and puts into context that moment in time. You know, we mentioned veterans the other day. Sometimes that context is really important in self-defense cases, what's happening there. This is the most important one, is what happens in the future, because that's what sentencing is about. The story is going to continue, and we're predicting a future that's there, and that's what the judge is being asked to do, or the prosecutor, or whoever making the decision for you. So we have to put it into context. And it's not, when you think about mitigation, it's not to excuse what happened. We have to be careful about that language, because I'm going to be quick to come back. This is an excuse. And it's not a defense. It's different. This is about understanding. It's not a defense that sends them home. But, you know, as you guys know, jurors get confused about that all the time. Judges and prosecutors do too, and use that language. So Aristotle talked about 5 elements of a story, and I'm going to add a 6th one. There's the act, thing happened. There's the actor, somebody did it. There's the means, right? So we've got Colonel Mustard in the library with the candlestick. So far we're going. There's a purpose or a motive, why, in every story. And for us, most of the time, that's not part of the jury instructions or the statute or the law, right? Very few crimes out there have a motive element, but it's very important to people going along on a story of understanding that reason why. And there's the context that I just talked about before. What I add to Aristotle for our context, our situation, is there's a 6th element. There's the consequences. What makes the world whole again? How does the universe end up with a sense that things have been put back together? And that's what the decision maker is making. The judge or the prosecutor in our case gets to be that person who sends this journey, this story, back to being whole again. Stories happen all the time, and I encourage you to watch for them everywhere. You're on your own story right now. I'm on my own story. They're interconnecting during this hour that we're together. They're all over the place. In the context that we're talking about, you know, there's the story of the thing that happened, Pauline manufacturing meth because she's better at recipes than her boyfriend. And then there's a story of going on in the courtroom, of the players who are in the courtroom, the prosecutor, the judge, the bailiff, the probation officer, whoever has influence there. And they're both going on at the same time, and they're influencing each other. So who's usually the hero of the story of the thing that happened in the past? If we're thinking protagonist or hero. Usually the client or the actor. If you use Aristotle said it's the actor, but who would the actor would be a better way to say it. So it's often we're telling the story of our client. But what I want to encourage you to think about today is often that story of our client isn't going to work. Some of our clients are not the journey that the judge wants to go on. But we can tell the story from somebody else's journey that's still going to get us a lower sentence or not guilty if we're doing the first phase. So we want to think strategically about that. We are always telling our client's story, but they may not be the primary character in the story. It can be other people. Who's the hero in the courtroom story? Lawyer. Lawyer. I am the hero. Judge. Yeah, I think it's the judge or whoever gets to make the choice for that 6th element. Who's the hero who sweeps in and puts the world right again? The judge gets to be Zeus who comes down on the machine and saves things, or whoever you are in that. So, but we have to tell both of these. If we're just telling one of the stories, it's not going to work. And we need to be thinking about stories being everywhere. And that's the consequences is why the judge is the hero. So, what I also want you to think about is we're thinking about stories and how stories work. You know, there's that person who's the main person of the story is there. So there's our client. But they run into people along the way that usually help them on their journey and play different roles in getting through things. So they may have the defense team there with the lawyers and the social worker and investigators are there. But we also need more than that. That's not enough. They run into mentors and guides through a story along the way. So might be the prosecutor, might be a social worker, might be somebody at a treatment provider, begins to play this mentor role if we start thinking in terms of story structure. And often the judge, gets to be the mentor, the wise mentor who puts this story in the right way. Without Yoda, Luke would have ended up in a different place. The story would have gone a different direction. So our judge gets to play this guardian, mentor, Yoda, Gandalf, Dumbledore, wise old man, or kind woman, the mother role that's there in most myths and stories that are out there. So you may hear me saying, I'm starting to talk about myths. What's shifted me in my presentation here is there's this cool video, and I've been studying the hero's journey with Joseph Campbell my whole life, and fantastic stuff, but he's a pretty dry read, so it's hard to connect with. So this new video came out, and Diane's going to send you the links to my videos if you want to share them with other folks. So let's watch this one talking about the hero's journey, and for me, it opened my eyes to a different way of thinking about this stuff, and it helped me with that story arc. How does that really work? Watch this. I think the structure is very cool and excites me. But I think one of the most important things about this video to me is the idea that this is everywhere. And it's constantly going on. And I invite you to look for it everywhere. And think about how it can help your clients, how it can help you, how it can help whoever you're working with. You're on one of these journeys right now, right? You came here yesterday, away from your status quo. You would have been in court or doing whatever you're doing. There was a call to adventure from Colette and Norman. Let's go. There's the departure into this stuff. You're running into mentors along the way like Keith and Deja and others who are up here trying to do things. You may have a moment of crisis where you're going back and forth that this is BS or maybe I should keep listening. Where does it go? And hopefully, if we're doing our job, there's some treasure that you get from this that you can go back and apply in your next negotiation or along the way. It's everywhere. Look for it around you. But look for it in our clients' lives and the judges' lives and the people who are there. So often people approach sentencing as just this first step. It's just the backstory, right? If Harry Potter never left living underneath the staircase, and went to Hogwarts, so where's the story there, right? There's a guy who lives under the stairs. So the backstory is important of knowing where our clients are and explaining what the status quo is, but we need to get beyond that because we're telling a story that the judge gets to play a role in later to be Yoda or the mentor along the way. So we get this call to an adventure and assistance is their interaction with the criminal justice system, is that shift in their lives. And they head off on this departure, which could be hopefully starting probation, it could be going off to prison. There's a thing that's going to shift in their lives. And as I'm saying, watching for it everywhere, because this is happening just in pretrial release as well, right? So they're getting arrested, they're going to court. Their departure might be that they're locked up on bail and how they're interacting in jail, where she's going to AA meetings there, or their departure might be being out under some pretrial conditions, and they're starting their journey right then in the trials they're going to get through that you're going to talk about, how well they did judge while they were out on bond is part of the story. So this stuff is happening in the courtroom, and this stuff is starting to happen on the future or may already be happening down here, the trials. But let's go back and see what happens with the Scott West, and if there's more we get from how Pauline's case went. That's the departure here. As when the judge says, yes, I'm going to send her home. Things have changed in her life. She's out, but she's under strict conditions. She's going to go through some trials. And she may come to a crisis point later where the judge decides what's going to happen when he comes back for the sentencing in 2 weeks. So let's see what happens when she comes back. So the client's journey now, she had the departure. She's been on the first trial of those 2 weeks. She's going back. She's picked up some more mentors along the way. Her parents and her grandmother are there to support her. She's going back to her main mentor who's giving her a new trial. As the hero goes through various trials, Hercules has to slay lots of different monsters along the way.
Where's the lawyer during that last hearing?
Actually, that's the woman standing next to them, Valletta, was there because Scott was probably teaching someplace. So yeah, he wasn't at that one. So, but the other thing, so this is the client's journey that we're talking about, but there's also the key member of this, the other character's the son's on a journey, right? And that's somebody who's really important to the judge, who's on his own journey. So it's the son's on this journey as well of recovering and needing his mother there. And it's that connection to that son and the right hero protagonist there that got the judge interested. So the judge on his own is making it's the son's story, right? And he's playing the mentor who's helping the son's mentor in this cycles that are all playing out here that we need to think about. Maybe the most important. Another key part of this, the judge is on his own journey, right? He started out with, yeah, the sentencing stuff's crazy, but I'm a judge, he's going away. I got to run for re-election. All his concerns, but he's got this call to adventure when that was asked for that furlough and he made that, something hit him. And he goes, I'm going to take a risk on this one. I'm going to depart on my own journey and we'll test this out and see how it goes along the way. So the judge went on his own journey of taking the risk and had his own trials and has come to a place where he's coming back to his world, hopefully with this treasure that's going to help other clients of, sometimes this does work in these cases that are out there. Let's see where I am on the time here. So we're going to invite you to do, and I'm going to introduce Raj while he's coming down, is I'm going to show you a different video in just a moment. Raj is here. These are the last two places that I know Raj was. He's from San Jose. But a few days ago, he was in Moscow teaching people there. Before that, he was in Lexington with my folks here. Raj is with Debug. He's going to get a better introduction in a moment. But I asked him to come down because we've talked some about this structure. So, yeah. Thanks, Raj. So we're going to watch this. If you grab the handout, which you'll grab when you leave if you don't. If anyone needs one right now, Diane did us the great favor of writing out the different scenes in here. And this is going to tie into what you're doing in small groups, so this is a good time to stay awake. It's a 9-minute video. And as you watch it, think about if this were a rough cut and you were the editor and you wanted to experiment with Hero's Journey, how would you recut this together? And what scenes might you want to add or go out and film that may still not be there to have this be a complete journey? So it'll make sense as you watch it. So watch this and enjoy what Raj has done, and then we'll set up what we're doing in the small groups. Okay. So what I'd like you guys to think about after we go to the small groups here is this is absolutely rich with the stuff we've been talking about. Those 3 questions are all over it. There's a lot of stuff to get your attention in there. There's a lot, actually not a whole lot of the background story there, but a lot in the trials and the mentors that he's gone through. And we've come to this crisis moment that his life could go on 2 different stories, right? The judge is going to send it off, he's going to go to prison, or he's going to have this chance maybe to go to law school and be a mentor and something else. So what I'd like you to experiment with is you're going to have Post-its in these rooms and storyboard this out. And you can think about whatever context works for you. If you were going to make a sentencing video, how would it be storied out if you just took this stuff and recut it? Or if it were a sentencing memorandum, or you're just talking to the judge, whatever works for your world. But also feel free to add stuff that you might think is missing here. If Raj brought this to you as a first cut and you still had 2 more weeks to do investigation, what other scenes do we want that would describe what the future might look like to fill out this treasure that he gets and how he returns? And we saw hints of it in there of him talking about him developing into a mentor and getting him all the way around the cycle that's there. So you have this handout that has this version of the hero's journey on the front. On the back of it's an example with Star Wars example, if that helps you connect a little bit more to following what it was. Then there's Diane, helped us so much by all the beats in this movie that are a place to work from. And then there's a worksheet at the end that I gave you to help with doing this exercise that we're going to do in small groups. My guess is because there's a list up here, the small groups have changed locations. So your call to adventure is to go play with this storyboarding stuff and see how this hero's journey might work for you.